records have been found of Israel ever having been in Egypt or ever having been enslaved in Egypt. The second argument was that there are no records of Israel's journey to the land of Canaan. The third argument is that the Bible condones slavery. And the fourth and final argument last week that was mentioned on the WhatsApp is that the Bible condones rape. I'm going to begin with the first argument, the claim that no records have been found of Israel ever having been in Egypt or of ever having been enslaved. Now we're dealing here with the discipline of archaeology. Archaeology is not the kind of discipline that you can say definitively and conclusively that there are no records, because as time goes by, archaeologists discover what they had not found in the past. Let me give an example. There are many examples, but I'll just give one. For 2,452 years, the city of Nineveh was so utterly devastated by the Babylonians and the Medes that people did not know where Nineveh was located, and they even questioned the validity of the Bible mentioning Nineveh. They didn't have any trace of the Assyrian Empire, which is so prominent in the Bible, in the book of Isaiah, for example. And so they looked at these accounts of Nineveh and of the Assyrians as evidence of the Bible having fictitious or mythical information. Now, 2,452 years after the destruction of Nineveh, there is an archaeologist by the name of Layard, who in 1845 definitely identified the location of Nineveh. And he and those archaeologists who came after him uncovered the ruins of the magnificent palaces of the Assyrian kings and hundreds of thousands of inscriptions in which we may read the history of Assyria as the Assyrians themselves wrote it, and which to a remarkable degree confirm the Bible. Now, what is my point? Archaeology is not a completed work. It is a work in progress. And so it is not reasonable to say that there is no record of Israel having been in Egypt or ever having been enslaved. In order to say this with legitimacy, a person would have to know everything that is buried under the earth in Egypt. And that is what archaeologists do not know. They're continually digging and they're continually finding new evidence. So that is not a reasonable claim to make, that there is no record of Israel ever having been enslaved in Egypt, simply because it is thought by some that no trace of Israeli occupation, no trace of Israeli enslavement have been found in Egypt. The next thing that I want to deal with concerning no record of Israel having been in Egypt or of having been enslaved in Egypt is the presupposition that this atheist has, that the Bible is not a history book with its own historical evidence. If the Bible is dismissed simply because archaeologists claim, or some archaeologists claim, that they have not found evidence of Israel having been in Egypt or of having been enslaved, then we find that the person presupposes that the Bible is unreliable history. But the Bible presents historical information. When you read the book of Exodus, for example, you read of two cities that were built by slave labor from the Israelites, Pithom and Ramses, in Exodus chapter 1, verse 11. You read about the river Nile turning into blood, which is another feature of the Egyptian landscape. When you read about the Exodus, you read about the fact that the Israelites did not take the northeasterly route by the Mediterranean Sea because they did not want, God did not want them to be involved in warfare. Well, that is what archaeologists have found, that along the northeastern section, where the Israelites would have had a shorter time to journey to the land of Canaan, there was a defense wall that the Egyptian government had built, and they were manned by Egyptian soldiers. And so if the Israelites went on that route, they would have had to do combat with these Egyptian soldiers. And so they took a southeasterly route to avoid conflict. Well, that is true to what archaeologists have found. So the history in the Bible is accurate, and we should not presuppose that it is not a history book and that there is need for outside evidence in order to believe any part of the Bible. So that is a presupposition that has to be. But let me get to the archaeological evidence. I do not agree with the atheist who says that there is no record of Israel having been enslaved in Egypt. But let me now get to specific archaeological findings that the atheists have not told you. They're holding back information from you that you need to know. There are two cities in Egypt that are specifically mentioned as having been built by the slave labor of the Israelites, which have been confirmed by archaeological findings that this is so. Exodus chapter 1 verse 11 says, "Therefore they did set over them taskmasters to afflict them with their burdens. And they built for Pharaoh treasure cities, Pithom and Ramses." So let us look at Ramses first and then Pithom second. According to the Haley's Bible Handbook, page 116, there is an archaeologist by the name of Petrie who in 1905 found an inscription made by the Pharaoh Ramesses II, and he said, and this is translated, it's a quotation, that he, quote, built Ramses with Asiatic Semitic slaves, end of quote. Notice he said that he built Ramses with slaves. But where did these slaves come from? They did not come from Egypt. Egypt was part or is part of the continent of Africa. It is not a part of the continent of Asia. These slaves did not originate in Egypt. They originated from elsewhere. Ramesses called them Asiatic slaves. In other words, they were slaves from the continent of Asia. But he went on further. He described them as Semitic slaves. Semitic means people who have descended from Shem, one of the three sons of Noah. We find in Genesis chapter 5, at the last verse, that Noah had three sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. And if we look in Genesis chapter 11 at the descendants of Shem, we will find that Abraham was a descendant of Shem, and that Abraham's descendants were known as Shemites or Shemitic people or Semitic people. So when Ramesses said that these slaves were Semitic, he means that they were descendants of Shem. And since Abraham was a descendant of Shem, and we find that Jacob, the grandson of Abraham, was a descendant of Shem, and his 12 sons were descendants of Shem, when they grew into a nation in the land of Egypt, they were known as Semitic. They were Semitic peoples from Asia. And so this is archaeological confirmation of two things. Number one, that the descendants of Abraham were in Egypt during the time of Ramesses II, king of Egypt. Number two, that they were slaves in Egypt, and that Ramesses used their slave labor to build the city of Ramses, just as Exodus chapter 1 verse 11 says. But notice there is another city mentioned in Exodus chapter 1 verse 11, and that it was said to have been built with the slave labor of the Israelites. We also know further in Exodus chapter 5 verses 10 through 19 that after Moses told Pharaoh to let Israel go, that Pharaoh said, these people have too much time on their hands. We have to give them extra work. And so we're no longer going to give them straw to mix with the clay to make bricks. They will have to get the straw for themselves. Did you know that archaeologists have actually found that in the city of Pithom, built by these slaves, that they found that in the lower courses of the buildings, they have brick that is filled with good chopped straw. When they go to the middle courses of the buildings, they find less straw. And when they go to the upper courses of brick in the buildings, they find pure clay having no straw whatever. This is archaeological confirmation that these Israelites who were not provided with straw, after Moses asked the king of Egypt to let Israel go, that they are the same ones that built the city of Pithom. For what was found in the bricks at Pithom correspond literally with what we have in Exodus chapter 5, verses 10 through 19, of no straw being provided for Israel to put in the clay mud. Another archaeological finding that confirms the presence of Israel in Egypt and that they were slaves and left Egypt is that the Pharaoh of the Exodus, whoever it is, there are two possibilities. There is Amenhotep II, who is an earlier Pharaoh, and there is Merneptah, which is a later Pharaoh. Both of these are considered by scholars to be candidates for being the king of Egypt at the time of the Exodus. But what we note, archaeologists say that both of these men were not succeeded by their firstborn son. They were succeeded by somebody else who was not the one originally designated to be king. What happened to the firstborn son of Amenhotep II? What happened to the firstborn son of Merneptah? Well, whichever man was the king, we find archaeological confirmation of what is in Exodus chapter 12, that the firstborn of the Egyptians, from the firstborn of Pharaoh, king of Egypt, to the firstborn of the servant, that they died. And this is again confirmation that Israel was in Egypt and that they were enslaved by the Egyptians. Now, let me go on to the second claim, that there is no record of Israel's journey to the land of Canaan. Well, this also is based on the presupposition that the Bible is not a history book recording reliable information. But if you were to read Numbers chapter 33, there is a chronological, detailed listing of the different places that the Israelites went to after they left Egypt and when they were at the border of the land of Canaan. The Bible has its own history with its own evidence, but that is dismissed by the atheists. Another thing to consider is that when these Israelites were journeying in the desert, they didn't build houses, they lived in tents. Now, how can you expect to find much information about people journeying from one country to another if they lived in tents, which they would take down and set up at different places? They didn't build permanent structures. They lived in tents. It wasn't until they reached the land of Canaan that they would live in houses. So it would be unfair to say that because of the scarcity of evidence of a nation wandering in the desert, that therefore they did not journey to the land of Canaan. Now, to say that there is absolutely no record of their journey is not fair, based upon the record we have in the Bible, starting in the book of Exodus and going right through to Deuteronomy. That records the journey of the Israelites to the land of Canaan. But I'm going to look at archaeologists now. There are information that archaeologists, many of whom are atheists and have a bias against trying to show that the Bible is accurate, there is information they're holding back from you. We find in the Bible in Numbers chapter 20, verses 1 and 11, that when Israel came to a place called Kadesh Barnea, that the people murmured against Moses and asked him to give them water. And Moses was so angry that even though God told him to speak to the rock, Moses struck the rock twice. And what happened? Water started to flow from the rock. Did you know that archaeologists have found that spring at the same place called Kadesh Barnea? They found what they call a strangely beautiful oasis fed by two springs. Notice, two springs. Remember, Moses struck the rock twice. Fed by two springs flowing from beneath a rock cliff. These two springs burst forth and are still flowing. Imagine that. These springs are still flowing. But the archaeologists don't want to tell you that. But that is a confirmation that at some point Israel was at Kadesh Barnea and Moses struck the rock twice and water came out. Also, to say that there is no evidence of Israel journeying to the land of Canaan, there is some information that you're not hearing. In Joshua chapter 1, verse 1, we hear that Joshua replaced Moses after his death as the leader of Israel and took them from the border of the land of Canaan into the land of Canaan itself. Did you know that the name of Joshua is mentioned in a letter written in the same period of time that Joshua lived in, judged by archaeology? It was written from the land of Canaan to Pharaoh, king of Egypt, complaining that the cities in the land of Canaan were being conquered. And this is found in Haley's Bible Handbook, page 157. These are called the Amarna tablets because the letters were received in Egypt at a place called Amarna. So there is a collection of letters from the people of Canaan, from their governments, that are in Egypt today called the Amarna letters. And in one of those letters, the name of Joshua is mentioned. And that is in Haley's Bible Handbook, page 157. What about the conquest of the land of Canaan? Joshua chapter 6, verse 20 says that the walls of Jericho fell down flat. An archaeologist by the name of Garstan found that the outer wall fell outward and down the hillside, page 161. Also the destruction of Bethel and Ai by fire in Joshua chapters 8 and 12 was discovered by W.F. Albright in 1934, who found that they had been destroyed at a time coinciding with Joshua's invasion of the land of Canaan. Haley's Bible Handbook, pages 161 and 163. Also the destruction of Lachish and Debir by fire in Joshua 10, verses 32 and 39, was found by archaeologists to be a deep layer of ashes in both cities, having charcoal and lime, indications of a terrible fire, and the cultural marks of Joshua's time were present. Everything under it was Canaanite, everything above it was Israelite. Haley's Bible Handbook, page 163. Now, I could go on because I have more, but I'm going to shorten it. How could there be any conquest of the land of Canaan if the Israelites did not leave Egypt and journey to Canaan? And so we find that when there's evidence of the destruction after city in the land of Canaan, coinciding with the time of Joshua, the journey.
Brother Buckley, you're breaking up again. All right, I think Brother Buchan got knocked out again. Let me just double check.
Yeah,
yes.
I'm back.
Brother, back now.
All right. Back now.
Not much disconnection a while ago, so you can continue where you left off.
Yes. What atheists need to realize is that in addition to what I have said concerning what archaeologists have discovered, we can look at the present time and trace it back thousands of years into the past at the celebration of different festivals that the Israelites have been having. And we know that the festivals are a historical link between their present and their past. For example, the celebration of the Passover. That has been celebrated by the Israelites for many centuries. And this reminds them of the night when God passed through the land of Egypt, passed over the homes of the Israelites who had the blood of the lamb sprinkled on the two side posts and on the upper doorposts of their doors, but who went into the homes of those people who didn't have the blood of the lamb and destroyed their firstborn. It was what caused the king of Egypt to hurry Israel out of Egypt so that they could go. And every year they celebrate the Passover. And that is a historical reminder of what happened. Now, if that didn't happen, then why have they been celebrating this for thousands of years concerning the festival of shelters. The festival of shelters, we're told in Leviticus chapter 23, towards the end of the chapter, that one of the reasons for celebrating it was to remind the Israelites of the time when they wandered in the desert and lived in temporary shelters or tabernacles. Why are they still celebrating this? Unless there is a historical link concerning Christians. Where did the Lord's Supper come from? Jesus was celebrating the Passover festival also. And out of the Passover festival, he instituted his own supper called the Lord's Supper. And he presented himself as the Passover lamb. Jesus is our Passover lamb who has saved us and rescued us from sin and its control. So there are historical links between these festivals and events that took place in Israel's history. Now let me deal with the matter of morality. The presupposition that atheism has is that there is no God, and therefore there is no moral standard that God has given that applies to everyone everywhere. And if there is no moral standard that applies to everyone everywhere, the atheist says it is up to you and me to make up our own moral standard. Why then will an atheist take his or her own moral standard and judge God for not following their own moral standard? Now, I'm not saying that God is not following the moral standard he should follow. I mean, he's the very basis for the moral standard. But the claim to say that God is doing something wrong, how can you say that if each person should make up their own standard? Who are you to judge me for not following your standard? And so that is an inconsistency in atheism. True atheism cannot really say that something is right or wrong. It really is a matter of preference or choice. That's your preference or choice, and that is my preference or choice. But to say that something is right or wrong are concepts that come from the Bible, and which in turn come from God, who spoke the words that the writers wrote in the Bible. So what the atheists are doing is borrowing from the worldview that God has and using it against God. Now that is quite inconsistent. Why is it that you have rejected God's moral standard and you have set up your own contrary standard, and then you use God's own standard to judge him when you don't believe there is a God and you don't believe in one standard for everyone? But having said that, the charges that are brought against God because the atheists have put God on trial, you know, brothers and sisters in Christ, it is very strange to me because we are sinful human beings, and the ones who should be on trial are us. We are the ones who should be on trial because we have not lived up to God's moral standards. But the atheist has turned the tables around, and instead of us being on trial, they have put the Creator on trial, trying to use his own moral standards against him. But even so, they have misinterpreted the evidence. So let me get into the specifics briefly. The charges brought against God, that he condoned slavery because slavery is recorded in the Bible. But as I pointed out last week, God did not institute slavery. He did not command that slavery be started by any human being. When God revealed his laws, it was to regulate an institution that man had started to ensure that people who are treated as slaves be treated fairly and kindly. It was not to approve of slavery, but it was to ensure that those who are in slavery would not be oppressed and unfairly and unkindly treated. Let me show you that the Bible does not approve of slavery. Exodus chapter 21, verse 16, Deuteronomy chapter 24, verse 7, and 1 Timothy chapter 1, verse 10, both Old Testament and New Testament, says that capturing people and selling them as slaves is wrong. You can read that for yourselves. Also, the Bible says that a slave who ran away from his master was not to be handed back to him, but was to be allowed to live anywhere he wanted without being taken advantage of. Deuteronomy 23, verses 15 and 16. Also, we find that the law of Moses teaches us to treat each other with the same respect and kindness that we want others to treat us with. And this fundamentally undermines capturing people, selling them as slaves, and treating them with cruelty. Matthew chapter 7, verse 12. Also remember, the second most important commandment in the law of Moses is to love your neighbor as yourself. Matthew chapter 22, verses 38 and 39. That alone undermines slavery, because who wants to be enslaved? Who wants to work without getting pay? Who wants to be beaten? Who wants to be treated with disrespect and unkindness? Well, if you love your neighbor as yourself, you're not going to do anything to your neighbor that is harmful, because you don't want to do anything harmful to yourself. This commandment alone undermines the institution of slavery. Furthermore, in the section of the Hebrew Bible called the Torah, which is in English law, in the book of Genesis chapter 1, verse 26, the very foundation for how human beings should treat each other is found in the words that God made human beings in his image and likeness. It is because we are God's image and likeness that we have an inherent dignity and honor, and that people should respect each other. And this undermines the institution of slavery. In the New Testament, the Holy Spirit revealed additional principles that undermine slavery. Philippians chapter 2, verse 3, and Romans chapter 12, verse 10 says that God wants us to consider others better than ourselves, and to put the interests of others before our own interests. Now, how can we do that? And we look down on certain people as if they're less than human and treat them as animals. Also, the principle Jesus gives in 1 Corinthians 7, verse 23 is, since I bought you with my blood, you are my servant. You must not become the slave of any human being. 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 23. So the charge brought against God is false. God is not guilty of condoning slavery. But what about the fourth claim, the charge that God condones rape? And two cases were brought up from the Bible. The case of Dinah being raped by Hamor, son of Shechem, and the case of Israelite soldiers capturing women in battle and allegedly raping them. Well, let us look at these charges. Genesis chapter 34 shows that God did not approve of rape. I say with all due respect, I don't mean any offense, but I have to ask the question, Did you, sir, who do not believe in God, read Genesis chapter 34 for yourself before you used it as an evidence of God approving rape? I really wonder if you did, because when you read it, you find that rape is said to have defiled the victim, that is, made the victim unclean. Genesis chapter 34, verse 5. Rape was said to be folly, that is, it was foolishness. Genesis chapter 34, verse 7. Foolishness in the sense that it ought not to be done. Also, it was specifically said in Genesis chapter 34, verse 7, that rape ought not to be done. And having seen that, how could you conclude that God condones rape? There is a principle of biblical interpretation that I want to share with you. Interpret the historical sections of the Bible in the light of the commands section in order to know if what is recorded was approved by God. Because good things are recorded in biblical history, bad things are recorded in biblical history, but how do you know which is what God approves of and disapproves of? You can know that by comparing what is done with what is commanded by God. For example, God has restricted sex to the marriage relationship. Genesis chapter 1, verses 26 through 28, and Genesis chapter 2, verse 24. And rape is explicitly forbidden in Deuteronomy chapter 22, verses 25 to 27. So when you have Hamor, the son of Shechem, raping Dinah, the daughter of Jacob, does that therefore mean that God approved of what he did? It couldn't mean that. It could not mean that, because the command section of the Bible shows that God does not approve of it. But let us go to the second case that was introduced last week, that soldiers in battle were allowed to rape women. Well, the example is in Deuteronomy chapter 21, verses 10 to 13. It says nothing whatsoever about rape. What it does say is that soldiers were not commanded nor allowed to rape beautiful women in foreign countries. What they were allowed to do was, one, to respect their right to mourn for the death of their family members that were killed in battle. They were to be given a full month of mourning. And then the soldiers, if they wanted, if they liked these beautiful women, they were allowed to enter into a marriage relationship with them. They were not told that they could rape these women. And you can read that for yourself. It's clear to see Deuteronomy chapter 21, verses 10 to 13. But again, I ask, if you do not believe in one moral standard that applies to everyone everywhere, therefore, by implication, you believe that you as an individual and I as an individual have the right to make up our own standard based on our own desires and wishes and preferences. People don't think the same way. Let's face it, people are different. You just need to listen to a talk show program on radio or television. People are different. So they have different ways of thinking. So if we are left to our own individual standards, who are you, the atheist, to judge me or anyone else for not following your standard? And how are you going to ever say that somebody is right or wrong in an absolute sense, outside of your own personal standard, if there is no God who has set the law for how every human being should live? What you have done by denying the existence of God is to deny what is necessary in order to know what is right or wrong. You are left without a moral compass, and everyone does what is right in his own eyes. Judges chapter 17, verse 6. Without God, you cannot absolutely say that something is right or wrong. And another thing, if you're going to know or understand anything, you have to use some logic, which has to do with the laws of rationality. And if you deny the existence of God, how can you use logic to try to prove that God does not exist? Is logic something that is material and physical in nature? Is it something that you can put in a fridge? Is it something you can eat or drink? Logic is not a material substance. And if for you as an atheist, the only reality is that which is material and physical, and there is no spiritual entity, no spiritual reality, then not only do you deny the existence of God, but you deny the existence of logic. Now, logic is a system of rules governing correct reasoning, which cannot change and which applies to everyone everywhere. Now, how do we get logic if there is no creator who intelligently planned and designed and created our brain with the ability to think rationally and reasonably, which is part of what it means to be made in the image and likeness of God? If our brain is nothing but accumulated mutations of electrochemical accidents, which had a survival value to it, then how can rules apply to every individual everywhere to govern the way they reason? And if we don't follow those rules, we have committed errors in reasoning. There can be no logic in an atheist worldview. Therefore, how can you use logic to try to reason that there is no God, when the existence of logic presupposes the existence of an intelligent designer and creator? How can you rely on your senses of sight, hearing, tasting, touching, and smelling, if these are also mutations, millions of years of accidental errors? How can you trust what you see or rely on what you hear if these were not intelligently designed and created? How can you rely on your memory of what happened in the past if your brain is an electrochemical accident? If it was by random chance that you came to have a brain and there is no intelligent designer behind it, behind its creation, if it all happened randomly by accident, how can you rely on your memory? My friend, if you don't think there is a God, then there is no way you can know anything, because you won't be able to use logic. Even though you use it, you won't be able to justify or defend its use in an atheistic worldview. You would not be able to rely on what you see or what you hear. You would not be able to rely on your memory. And so, when you say that there is no archaeological evidence for Israel being in Egypt or having been enslaved, or no record of Israel journeying to the land of Canaan, and when you charge God with condoning slavery and rape, how are you able to know any of these things if there is no God? The existence of God is necessary if you're going to be able to know anything and to be able to interpret anything accurately. So, is there any question that you may have or any comment?
I want to thank Brother Buckland. Brother Buckland, what I'm going to do, I will share the video. I tell you, Brother Buchan did an excellent job today in terms of responding to the various claims that was said. For next week's class, I gave Brother Buckland some new information that was presented to me, which in terms of contradictions. I'm sure that I'm going to get some more when I pass this video on to the person. He's going to respond. So each week, maybe that will be the forum. Maybe that's how we'll have to be doing this discussion. I think works best. Maybe it actually works best that way. Sister Marcia, I see that you wanted to make a comment. Go ahead.
Yes, I must say I've learned so much. This is just good for me also. You know, I've learned so much. Thank you, Brother Buckland.
It is my pleasure.
I didn't even know that Shem was connected to
Thank you, Brother Buckland.
Semitic. Yes, Sister
right.
Chloe,
I
you're
didn't know.
welcome.
I learned something. Yeah, thanks.
Yes, you're welcome. And this is a good opportunity for members of the church, for fellow Christians, to be trained in an active apology